Well, let's get back underway. And I hope you feel some discomfort that image doesn't really fit with the Jesus I've just been talking about. Okay? This is very much the imperial Jesus, the Jesus of the Byzantine church with power. And not only, he doesn't look particularly Jewish maybe, but you don't want to mess with him. And if you're Jewish, you're likely to be on the wrong end of his violence, his power. Okay, the Pantocrator. So what I want to do in this session is, in some ways, it's an impossible task, but I want to just kind of quickly overview the last three chapters plus the kind of concluding reflection that's in the new book, and pick up issues about focusing on the human Jesus and why that might be theologically important, thinking a little bit around the questions of, so what's the cash value of talking about life after death, given what we now understand about life and death, and DNA and human genome and all that sort of stuff, all of which is way outside my expertise, but also taking seriously the fact that we actually live in a world of many religions and Christianity is just one of them. And how do we come to terms with that? And how big of a reconstruction are we going to have to do on our creeds and liturgies in order to begin to address that? So this is a much shorter presentation in terms of what I've got prepared on the slide, deliberately so that we could leave time for conversation. Okay, so let's jump in and see where we go. Okay, and I like this image as a contrast to the previous one. If Jesus was alive today, most Christians wouldn't want to sit next to him on the plane. Okay? Because he wouldn't be using a plane. Well, no, anyway. Okay. But you can see straight away the issue. If Jesus did come to church, would we accept his application for membership? Would he fit in with our neat Western lives? And so on. So anyway, and that's a kind of a rhetorical question, but I suspect we all agree on the answer. Okay, so just very briefly, in fact I've said this already, I want to look at the humanity of Jesus. I want to think a little bit about, so what's the point of talking about life after life? I want to take seriously the idea that we're in a world of many faiths and that all of this is going to impact on both our personal beliefs and the communities of practice that we might form or belong to. So step one is to think about Son of Man, that phrase, Son of Adam, meaning one of us, a human one. Remember the sons of Israel, sons of Jacob, it meant the person who belongs to the category of. So son of Adam means somebody who belongs to the category of human. Son of God means an angel, basically. Somebody who lives upstairs with the other people, not somebody who lives downstairs with us. Okay? And when the kings claimed to be sons of God, they weren't denying they were human, but they were actually claiming some upstairs prerogatives that normal mortals didn't enjoy. So I want to suggest that the humanity of Jesus is the pearl of great price that we've often overlooked. And we haven't been willing to sell all the rest of our treasures in order to really take seriously the humanity of Jesus. Okay? So this idea of the pearl of great price, I want to suggest that, and this I'm just throwing ideas out to hopefully provoke you into a conversation, but you probably already agree with me too much to argue. I think what we need is holy wisdom for living now rather than secret gnosis for getting into the next life. Okay? That's actually the big job, the missional job of the people who want to walk in the way that Jesus started. And so what I see potentially coming out of this is a fresh vision of what it means to be human in the kind of world we actually live in and know we are living in because we use the internet and we use the medical services and yet we still go to church and sing hymns and say prayers that don't connect at all with the world we live in. We even use the technology to project the words of inappropriate liturgies onto the wall. I mean, come on. And things like the Human Genome Project, things like climate change, even if the Australian government has outlawed it, and invasive information technologies and surveillance and da-da-da-da-da. That's the world we live in. Okay? What does it mean to be human in that kind of world? What does Jesus add to that in the world of the Human Genome Project? A couple of Sundays ago, I was speaking at Pitt Street Uniting Church in Sydney. Funnily enough, I don't often speak in an Anglican church in Sydney. And in the conversation afterwards, somebody said, I have no problem with all this, but I gave up on the historical Jesus years ago. I don't need a historical Jesus. So what's the point of the historical Jesus? Well, actually, unless there was a historical Jesus, then none of this is actually real. Okay? It doesn't mean we'll ever have it totally pinned down, but if it's just a kind of clever idea, that's cute, but I think it does actually matter that we can speak with some confidence about a historical figure, even if we have some difficulty, getting a close-up kind of fix on exactly what he was like. The other thing, I think, if we start to take the humanity of Jesus seriously and kind of tone down some of the theological, Christological, religious claims that Christians have been famous for, then we'll also contribute to the reduction in religious violence and religious hatred in the world. And a few weeks ago, none of us would perhaps have recognised that kind of image on the screen. It's the ISIS, the Islamic State people rampaging through Syria and, of course, Iraq. And many of us were not familiar with the Arabic letter Nun until very recently. But a number of us, myself included, have replaced our profile picture on Facebook with the Nun as a way, because it's for Nazarene. And they're painting nuns on the houses of Christian families in Mosul so they can come back and destroy them and kill the people living in them. Okay? So the religious violence. So, okay, we take a cheap shot at the Islamic extremists. Then we have the Jewish extremists who are writing death to the Arabs on the walls of Christian churches in Israel. Actually might even be St. Stephen's, I'm not sure. Could also be Tagba. And then, of course, we have our very own Christian extremists, like those marvellous, generous souls at Westboro Baptist Church in the USA. Planes crash, God laughs. Okay, fags doom nations, God hate fags, God.com. These are just the sort of Christians you want to be associated with, and that's why I guess I'm often happy not to use that adjective Christian. Okay, so taking the humanity of Jesus seriously will involve rethinking some of our theologies and our practices and our church structures and our liturgies and so on. But I think it will also contribute to a turning down of the rhetoric that leads to violence and suspicion and fear and hatred. However, it's not just a clever kind of theological, philosophical puzzle, just like working out how many angels could sit on the head of a pin or whatever. The humanity of Jesus is not sort of a neat idea to wrestle with, but it's to be observed in the kind of everyday aspects of life, of his kind of life. So, for instance, I do this in the book at one stage, and some of my Jewish friends and Palestinian friends had trouble with these couple of pages. I had a couple of paragraphs, almost a page, I think, where I talked about the Palestinian Jesus. Jewish friends don't like that. Okay? Now, I don't mean that Jesus was a Palestinian Arab. I mean that Jesus was a Palestinian. He lived in Palestine, he lived under occupation, and his opportunities for freedom and success were circumscribed, and indeed he was arrested and ultimately killed. That's very much a Palestinian experience. Sadly, it's not unique to Palestinians, but thinking of Jesus as a Palestinian is helpful, at least for someone like me. Then there's the Jewish Jesus. Some of you might have seen the BBC documentary 10 years ago now, probably, when they were trying to reconstruct, using sort of forensic scientists, to what would a typical first century Jewish male look like. So this is the same face from that image at the beginning about, would you want this guy going to sit in the chair next to you on the aeroplane? And of course, some of my Palestinian friends have trouble really thinking of Jesus as Jewish, because their experience of Jewish is in green uniform with a machine gun. Okay. And they want a Jesus who liberates them, not a Jesus who incarcerates them. Yeah, so there's a challenge there as well. And of course, he's both. He has to be both. And perhaps Jesus has something to say both to Palestinians and to Jews about getting beyond some stereotypes. Then there's the village, the agricultural worker, person who doesn't belong and doesn't thrive in the cities. And Jesus appears not to have gone to cities very often. When he went to Jerusalem, they killed him. Okay, now we don't know how many times he went to Jerusalem. Doesn't matter. But he met the fate of many prophets and many peasants who go to the city looking for the future and find disease and death, imprisonment, enslavement, etc., exploitation. So thinking of Jesus as a agricultural, non-urban person rather than a cultured city person. For instance, can never prove this, but I'd be pretty confident Jesus was illiterate. Now, for some people, that's a confronting idea. How can the Son of God not know his alphabet? Okay? Well, he didn't know he was the Son of God, did he? Because we hadn't made him that yet. Okay? So an illiterate Jesus, who may have been a gifted poet, but he didn't write stuff down because Nazareth was too small to have a village school. You don't do that in the first generation or so of a tiny village. And then of course, if you like, the third world Jesus. Now again, Jesus was no more African than he was Arab. But there's something about the Jesus experience, like the mortality rates in the village and the lack of clean water and lack of education, which is a third world experience. So when I talk about the human Jesus, I'm not talking about the ungod Jesus. I'm talking about the God who's in a particular historical place, under particular specific difficult circumstances, who belongs to a particular religious and ethnic tradition, who's outside the mainstream of big business and the economy and the trade networks of the time, and who lives in the world of the Millennium Development Goals. Okay, so an expendable Jesus, a Jesus we can do without, and often prefer to do without. So I'd want to suggest for our conversation that the human Jesus in many ways is a forgotten Jesus, and recovering his legacy may be a precious gift we can offer to the world, a world that's in need of real spiritual wisdom about what it means to be authentically human. So that's one set of hand grenades thrown out for you. Okay. The next one is imagining life after this, if we need one. And I shock people sometimes when I say, I'm not in the least bit interested in life after death. Maybe that's because I'm only 62. No, I don't know. But actually, for me, that's not the centre of my faith. Okay, it was when I grew up as a fundamentalist Christian in Lismore Church of Christ, ensuring I had eternal life and escaping the fires of hell and so on. That was core product for my community. But I'm a bit over that and not particularly interested. If it's there, it's there, and if it's not there, I won't know. I won't miss it, because I'll be gone, in some sense. But of course, who's gone? What's gone? That's of course the point of who is the I in all those statements. To what extent is this an individual, or am I an expression, a particular, unique expression of some other larger I? And which is sort of what I think the Human Genome Project and the wider DNA studies are telling us. As my children love it when I say, I have a lot in common with a cockroach. I say, yeah, you have. Okay. So what does that mean theologically? What does that mean anthropologically? Okay. And how might we start to rethink funeral liturgies? And what we focus on. Are we preparing people to walk up the mystical stairway, or are we actually preparing people to live authentically here and now while we still have a life to live? And yet there is something bigger, but it's not so much individual. It's not like a zillion million years of just sitting around playing harps or whatever. It'd be pretty boring. So one of the people I quote in the book is Elizabeth Johnson, a Roman Catholic theologian, who reflects in I'll put a few quotes because I really like her work, but one of her comments on the crucifixion is this one that's on the screen. The real thing about the death and resurrection story is that death does not get the last word. Okay? And the crucified one is not annihilated, but brought to new life in the embrace of God, who remains faithful in surprising ways. And she also talks about the Christian tradition and particularly the historical Jesus tradition as a life-affirming tradition rather than a martyrdom-affirming tradition. And it would be very easy for us all to think that the best thing we could do is to get ourselves crucified, okay, and be martyrs for the cause. But the best spiritual wisdom of Christianity has said, no, God wants you to live life to the full, not throw it away. So rethinking the resurrection tradition not as, wow, look what God did for Jesus, look what he's going to do for me, but what does it mean to be alive, and how much does it matter that we are alive and that we are contributing to something bigger and longer and larger than our own immediate situation. So what would it mean if we redefine Christianity as radically pro-life so that we actually gained a reputation as people who would never use violence, who would never cause harm to any of the little ones in our care, who would never glorify suffering, would never seek martyrdom, and would always turn the other cheek when abused? And to the extent that that doesn't sound much like the Christian church, we have a problem. Because that should be what we sound like. That should be our DNA. I suspect we'd have no trouble, or we'd have less trouble in saying those words and applying them to the Dalai Lama than to a number of other eminent religious leaders in our own tradition. And that's actually sad, that might be so. So having a sense that we're on about something bigger than me and bigger than all of us, that the resurrection of Jesus is not only something that God is always doing, God is always bringing possibility out of nothing, reality out of possibility, life out of death, life out of non-life, etc. That's what God is. And if we really grasp that, that could actually be the mission charter for the Christian faith in the global village. Okay? Not to steal people from the other gang, add them to our membership list, but to pray and work for the coming of God's kingdom, to pray and work for the resurrection of all creation, and to pray and to work for the day of cosmic liberation. And that actually sounds vaguely like Romans chapter 8, seems to me. Okay? If we had a vision like that, it would shape the way, as Christians, the way we understand God, because we'd think about God differently. We'd think about ourselves differently. We'd think about the world differently. It's not good when a biblical scholar is allowed to talk about theology and just throw things behind him and keep running. Okay, a world of many faiths. Okay, we all know that we live in a world of many faiths and that Christianity is large and global and so on, and has had an amazing impact on human history, not always for good. There are dark passages in our own history as well, but certainly in the parts of Brisbane I live in, the largest religious community on the last census was no faith. Okay? Not Catholic, not Anglican, certainly not Uniting, not even Christian. The largest group identifying were, in fact, no faith, no religion. So we're in a totally different reality from what everything about the way our churches are set up is designed for a reality we are no longer living in. And we're slowly perhaps coming to terms with that. So one of the kind of phrases I've played with over the years, and perhaps at an earlier stage this might have been the title for the book, but it would have been a different book as well, was something around the idea of sharing Jesus. Actually not letting go Jesus as in, sorry, we don't need you anymore, we're giving you the pink slip, but releasing Jesus so that he's not captive to our way of understanding him quite to the same extent. So that would mean, amongst other things, really taking seriously the essential Jewishness of Jesus. Okay? And we haven't done that very well. Because that would radically challenge so much of what we think and do as Christians, if we really took the Jewishness of Jesus seriously. And we need to chill out a bit about the Muslim Jesus, because they have their own traditions about Jesus, who's a very important prophet, second only to Muhammad in their understanding of God's dealings with humanity. And many of us feel that they've nicked our Jesus. Well, we nicked the Jewish Old Testament, and we nicked David, made him Saint David, and we nicked, that's what happens. Religious figures get revalued, get transvalued, take on new significance in different contexts. And I actually, I quite like sitting back and contemplating, not in a smug, we're going to get you in the end with our Trojan horse, but if we actually encouraged Islamic communities to engage seriously with the Jesus tradition within their Islamic framework, what might happen for them? Okay? How might Jesus function within that community? At the moment, he's got a job at the end of the world. In the meantime, he keeps out of the way. That's the official role for Jesus. Okay? But, historically, Muslims have been much more interested in stories about Jesus. And if you read Rumi and other sources, you'll find some of that. It would also mean taking leave of Christendom and a lot of the formulae and liturgies and creeds and so on that have gone with Christendom, and recognising that we are now well and truly in a post-Christian era, and even if we keep pretending otherwise. And that's okay as well. Christianity did pretty well when it wasn't a Christian era. Okay, the Jesus tradition can thrive, perhaps when it's not in power, in a way that it cannot thrive when it's in power. And this is, the last point is really, I guess, a nod to Lloyd Geary, who has argued that in many ways we should see secular humanism as the product, one of the best products of 2,000 years of Christianity. Okay? And we shouldn't be so upset about secularists and humanists and so on. They've actually taken on board some of the most profound insights of living human life informed by what we might call gospel values. They just no longer use religious language to do that. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. And there's the idea, and I'm sure I'd be really surprised if there's any serious kind of quibbling around any of this, but who knows. What will be the hallmarks of actually living with others in the spirit of Jesus? Now, one of the things I didn't mention this morning at Ewing and wasn't really part of the earlier presentation is, in terms of Christian communities in Israel and Palestine, very, very small, very tiny communities, generally speaking. But one of the dynamics is that you will find villages that have Muslims and Christians, and you'll have villages that have Druze and Christian, and you'll have villages that have Muslim, Druze and Christian, but you'll never find a Muslim in a Druze village. Okay? Now, what do we make of all that? I don't know exactly, but certainly the Christians in Palestine understand themselves to some extent that their mission is to be like the oil that keeps the non-Christian people. They're not trying to convert them. That would get you into serious trouble. But they change the dynamics in a village when there are Christians there. Okay. Now that's not all innocent. If you drive into, say, 100%, there are only 6 100% Christian villages left in Israel and the West Bank. One of them is Fasuta, right up on the border of the Lebanese-Israel border. And as you drive into the village of Fasuta, 100% Christian, Melkite village, there's a very large statue at the first roundabout, the prophet Elijah about to slaughter one of the prophets of Baal. So multi-faith harmony is not an explicit value of the Christian tradition, okay? No pagans in our town. And yet there is another level where functionally, in mixed villages, Christians can actually make the place more human and safer for everybody. If only it was like that in every village where there were Christians present, in every city And if that's the difference, so when people heard there was a move to build a Uniting Church or an Anglican Church or a Catholic Church or a Hillsong Church in their suburb, they'd say, wow, the property values are going to go up, the social dynamics are going to improve, the crime rate is going to drop because the Christians are coming. Instead of they're going to mess our car parking up or whatever. Okay? So something is, we've missed the boat there somewhere. So compassion is one of the hallmarks. Humility, of course, would be another. Joy. Inclusiveness, we're famous for that, eh? Non-violence. Okay. We have burned at the stake our fair share of heretics and Catholics and others over the years. Community. And, of course, generosity. And they will often, I suspect, be built around projects. Community projects and global aid and development projects, as well as projects about addressing social harmony, racial hate speech and so on. Maybe it would have been a good strategy, rather than changing the laws about jihadists living on sort of Centrelink benefits in Syria, to actually see how might the religious communities address this at the grassroots, rather than coming in and offending or at least a significant percentage of the leadership of a particular community. Okay, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but that's all I want to put in as sort of contribution for this part, as stimulus for the conversation, and look forward to kicking some ideas around with you. And maybe Greg won't invite me to preach at Ewing ever again.